Hello there, AP World History people. Let's keep learning about global conflict with the biggest global conflict in all world history, World War II. Mr. Brown has consumed all the media, read all the books. I know everything. I'll have a debate with any kid about any concept relating to this war. So let's first of all go with what caused World War II. Well, the League of Nations did a terrible job at keeping world peace. The whole purpose of the League of Nations, as I said in the last video, was to not allow for a second world war to happen, but it didn't really authentically represent people. The other one is that World War II was a result from Germans feeling that they were being treated unfairly from the outcome of World War One. The Treaty of Versailles treated Germany just terribly, and yeah, like that hatred and that resentment boiled in German culture and led to Hitler and the Nazis and the Second World War. And speaking of Hitler, openly talked about war, openly increased the German military, openly defied the Treaty of Versailles. But the rest of the world was like, he just wants some tanks to show off. He just wants to play around with his submarines and his little soldiers. It'll be fine. It won't be fine. It won't be fine. You got to stop bad guys before they get too powerful. And the other thing about World War II is Japan was late getting into the imperialism game. I mean, they had that whole Meiji Revolution. I mean, they caught up, but they were still behind the other European powers for so long. And so Japan really did have a desire to play imperialism as well. And they knew that they were the only really powerful country on their half of the world. And they were like, hey, we could kind of carve up China and carve up Southeast Asia just like the Europeans carved up Africa. And we could benefit much like the Europeans did. So Japan just wanted to sort of play their own version of imperialism. And all these are reasons for World War II. And I'm going to be very clear about this. I think World War I was inevitable. I think that World War I would have happened regardless of the specific events that caused it. But I think World War II, it's largely just kind of an extension of World War I. And I'm of the very strong belief that once we get, 100 years in the future, 200 years in the future, people won't even differentiate between World War I and World War II. People will just sort of say the big world war that sort of continued from the end of World War I into World War II. You got to have just peace agreements, kids. And it's going to result in 75 million people being killed. All right, let's check it out. Clicking the button. Okay, so here's just some more official setup for World War II, what officially started it. Well, Hitler was an excellent politician and diplomat, believe it or not. Hitler made a lot of friends. He made alliances with Japan, Italy, Finland, Romania, and the USSR. Hitler and Stalin were like buddies for a short time. He will betray the USSR in 1941, but I mean, if Hitler somehow got the Soviet Union and Stalin to like be on his side authentically throughout the war, I don't know if we could have won. Hitler's scheming ultimately came to a head at an event called the Munich Conference. At this point in history, Hitler had already annexed the country of Austria and had Austria join up with Germany. So Hitler was incorporating the Austrian military, incorporating the Austrian economy, and just sort of improving and increasing Germany's power. But Hitler then had his eyes on Czechoslovakia. And I am ethnically Czech, and I'm sure that some of my genetic ancestors were in Czechoslovakia during this time. And the Czech people did not want to integrate with the Nazis. We wanted to be our own. We wanted to be independent. We didn't want to be a part of it. So the Czech people were like, okay, we'll fight. Like, we'll declare war if the Nazis are just going to take us over. But the only way we'll declare war and have a chance of winning is if we have allies. So the Czech delegation contacted Britain, France, and some other countries and were like, okay, will you actually help us fight the Nazis? And then Hitler used his speaking skills and somehow convinced the British and the French delegation that the Czech people deserved to be incorporated with the Nazis, and that if Hitler could just incorporate Czechoslovakia with his big, giant, new version of Germany, then Hitler would be happy and it would be world peace forever. So the British and the French were like, all right, Hitler, go ahead and have Czechoslovakia. And when that happened at the Munich conference, the Czech people just generally felt betrayed. Czechoslovakia is a place that makes a whole lot of military equipment, make a whole lot of tanks, a whole lot of guns. And Czechoslovakia is like, all right, I guess we're Nazis now. And so they just joined up with Hitler and gave him all that military power. And kids, by so many accounts, if Britain and France had just stood up with Czechoslovakia and actually fought the Nazis then, the war wouldn't even have been a challenge. They could have crushed Hitler so fast, but they just continually were allowing Hitler to get everything he wanted, to break all the peace treaty rules, to prepare his military, to get his economy ready for war. And it's going to result in the most serious global conflict in all world history. So if someone's bullying you, don't give them what they want. Stand up to them, or they will continually bully you again and again and again until they get more and more powerful. And this whole concept is called appeasement. I probably should have written it on this slide, but whatever, it's cool. Okay, so of course, after Hitler fully integrates Czechoslovakia, he then sets his sights on Poland. And he says, all right, I'm going to take over Poland now. And the rest of the world's like, crap. We made a mistake with this guy. So Britain and France say, Hitler, if you attack Poland, we're going to declare war on you. And Hitler's like, all right, let's throw down. So that's when World War II officially starts on September 1st, 1939. Hitler and all his buddies they're going to be known as the Axis powers, and their opponents are going to be the Allied powers. And thankfully, the alliance structure is pretty similar from World War I to World War II. It's just, in World War I, the Central Powers were Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Turks. This time, the Ottoman Turks are sitting it out, and it's Germany, Austria are one united country now, but they also recruit Finland, Romania, Italy, and Japan. So World War II is definitely going to be a larger scope of a global conflict, and it's going to be way more deadly and way scarier, in my opinion. All right, let's check it out. So the war begins. Many people, including Hitler actually, assumed that this war would go the exact same way as World War I. They assumed there'd be this long, drawn-out battle in France, there'd be trenches and stuff. But one of Hitler's young generals, this guy named von Manstein, he said, Hitler, I've got this plan, okay? If we take out Paris, the French will quit the war. So give me all of our best tanks and all of our vehicles, and I'm going to drive those vehicles through this forest near the Belgium-French border. Yeah, once again, the Nazis also did the same strategy in World War I. They just went around the French defenses and went through Belgium. They should have learned their lesson from World War I. But anyway, so this von Manstein guy comes up with this plan called Blitzkrieg tactics, where they're just going to drive straight into the enemy country, don't give them time to build trenches, don't give them time to set up defenses, and just take out countries quick. And sure enough, the Nazis conquer Poland in like 4 weeks, conquer Denmark in 3 weeks, Norway in 3 weeks, Netherlands in 3 weeks, Belgium in 3 weeks, and France in 6 weeks. France has been a major world power for all of world history, and the Nazis knock them out in 6 weeks. It's crazy. We're not even a year into this war, and Hitler's already taken over more than half of continental Europe. My goodness. And Hitler was, by all accounts, thinking that his guys were just invincible. I mean, he did what no one ever did in World War I. He got France to be knocked out of the war. At this point, his only opponent was the British, and he already had his submarines start to surround the British Isles. They weren't going to get any reinforcements. He was bombing London all the time with his planes. Hitler just thought, he was like, yep, we're doing it. Nazis on the rise. So Hitler then says, okay, let's do this same blitz strategy and let's attack the Soviet Union. So he assembles the largest army in world history, and he's going to betray Joseph Stalin and start a war with Russia. All right, let's check it out. So it is the largest war in world history. so many people. Is it? It's not the longest war in world history, but it's definitely the most involved war. And the Nazis had four objectives during the war. And believe it or not, you can actually read these objectives in Hitler's book Mein Kampf that he wrote in, I think, 1934. And so here are the four objectives. Acquire more land for Germany in the east. And what is east of Germany? Well, Poland, the Soviet Union. And that concept is called Lebensraum in German. Another thing he talks about in his book is to destroy communism. Well, if you're the only communist country in the world, the Soviet Union, you probably shouldn't make alliances with Hitler. You should probably be aware, dude's probably going to betray you. The other thing, Hitler wants to rid the world of the Jewish people, and the vast majority of the world's Jewish people lived in the Soviet Union. Hitler wanted to create a new world order where Nazis would be the dominant race in charge of the global economy. Hitler had all these crazy plans to turn Germany into this, or Berlin especially, into this global international city, and for the Nazis to kind of establish their own version of imperialism. They were going to take over Africa and harvest it for its resources, and it was just it's some serious negative aspects here, kids. I'm really glad the Nazis didn't win the war. Okay, spoiler alert: Nazis don't win the war. But yeah, there's some scary stuff. Okay, now let's talk about Britain. So Britain was fighting the Nazis from the beginning, and no one expected France to get knocked out so quickly. So the British had this pretty serious moment where they're like, oh my gosh, like France is out of the war. We've lost all of our other allies. It's just us versus the Nazis right now. Can we even do this? And their Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, is just instrumental in keeping the country fighting against the Nazis. Definitely one of the best leaders in world history, because any other leader probably would have just saw the power of the German war machine and been like, we can't win, we quit. But Winston Churchill's like, we're gonna fight all the way to the end. And the struggle with the British Empire too is, as I said in the World War I video, they had all these colonies all around the world. And in World War I, they successfully recruited people from their colonies to fight in the trenches. But as soon as those guys fought in the trenches and came home, they're like, hey, all those promises we were given, the British didn't actually abide by them. So don't help them if another world war happens. And all over, actually, the British Empire during World War II, there were like mini revolts and people trying to fight against them. One of the guys who sort of had a revolt was Mahatma Gandhi. He's going to be an important person in my next unit. But he tried to say, hey, people of India, don't help Britain fight this war. They promised us all kinds of stuff in World War I. They didn't do it, so there's no reason why they would do it this time around. In fact, Gandhi wrote letters to Hitler pledging his friendship. Gandhi said, hey, Germans, if you ever get to India, you're going to have a friend in me. Look, Gandhi didn't know all the evil and terrible things the Germans were doing. Gandhi just wanted Britain gone. He wanted India to be independent, and he said, if anybody's fighting the British, then I'll work with them, I guess. And also at this time, it was unclear what the future of India would be, because during this period, this entire mass of countries here was collectively called India. But as we know today this is like 6 different countries. But yeah, so this was definitely the shining hour for the British Empire. They barely held their empire together. And as soon as this war is over, the British Empire is just going to start collapsing and fading away, because these people are going to hold them accountable. It's like, okay, if we help you fight the Nazis this time, we want to be independent when this is over. Yeah, so there you go. All right, moving on. Okay, now with this war going on in Europe, Japan decides to enter the war. And Japan saw that the world was distracted with all these events in Europe, so they decide to surprise attack European imperial possessions in Asia and destroy the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. They think that if they can just destroy the American fleet, then all of Asia will be wide open to them. They can take over all these imperial possessions, and they can just, play imperialism, but just have Asia all for themselves. They use their own blitz-style tactics, just like the Nazis, but they mostly used boats and airplanes, and they conquered half of China, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, and hundreds of islands all across the Pacific. The Japanese also looked like they were this unstoppable force, and the whole rest of the world was super freaked out, and especially the Japanese utilized this as this sense, because this is now like the first time in world history, well, not the first time, but the first time since imperialism, where a non-European power is defeating European powers. So a lot of the rest of the world sort of was like, whoa, like we can actually fight the Europeans and the Americans, but the Japanese are going to treat these people really terribly too, which is really sad. All right, moving on. So what were Japan's objectives during the war? Well, as I said, they wanted to have their own version of imperialism. And their concept of imperialism is known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Why did it have to be that long? Oh my goodness. But yeah, they said, we're going to be the economic and cultural leaders of Asia. All of Asia is going to just provide primary materials for us, and we're going to be Asia's factory. And they really saw that, especially the Dutch in Indonesia and the French in Southeast Asia, the British in China, the Americans in the Philippines, that they didn't belong there. It's like, you guys aren't Asian, get out of here, this is our land now. Even though Japan is talking this kind of like positive message saying like Asia for the Asians, in reality, that's not going to be the case. In reality, the Japanese, they're just going to keep all those imperialism systems going, and they'll treat the other Asian people simply terribly. I hope I've already mentioned some stories to you kids just about how much Koreans to this day hate Japanese and how much Chinese to this day hate Japanese. And I'm going to briefly mention the concept of comfort women, because when I lived in South Korea, I actually met some survivors who were comfort women during World War II. And the short meaning of comfort women is these were Korean women who were told they would be sent to Japan to work in factories in Japan. So they were these young girls, they signed up, and in reality, they were never sent to a factory. They were terribly, terribly abused by Japanese people. Also Japan passed these really terrible laws all over their possessions in Asia, saying that babies have to have Japanese names and that people have to speak Japanese, and they really try to oppress other cultures. And it's the things the Japanese did just are totally on par of the brutality of what the Nazis did in their conquests of Europe. Okay, so the big differences between World War I and World War II, and this is where I'm actually especially going to talk about the Soviet Union. So in World War I, just about all the fighting was on the Western Front in France. But in World War II, just about all the fighting was on the Eastern Front between Germany and the Soviet Union. Even once America gets in the war and lands guys in France on D-Day, 85% of the German army was still fighting the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, by all accounts, just put up the most resilient defense in all world history. I mean, at the beginning, the German Blitzkrieg tactics pushed 3,000 miles into the Soviet Union. They got to the gates of Moscow. Stalin was thinking about dismantling his government structures in Moscow and running deeper into the country. But ultimately, the Soviet people defended at the last minute. Winter came down. Those Nazi tanks got stuck in the snow. And the Soviets call this the Great Patriotic War, because this was their chance to sort of prove that Russia wasn't going to go down without a big old fight. And the largest battle ever in the history of the world was the Battle of Stalingrad. And Stalingrad was this really important city in southern Russia that was right along this river that was kind of the resource pipeline into the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union recognized if they lost that city, they'd probably lose the war. So the Soviet Union just sent everybody they could into that city. They sent in soldiers. In World War I, famously, they sent in soldiers with knives. But I think at the Battle of Stalingrad, they sent in soldiers that just had nothing and said, sorry, guys, like, you've got to make the Nazis waste bullets. And somehow the Soviet Union managed to hold out, managed to finally defeat the Nazis at the Battle of Stalingrad. And after the Battle of Stalingrad, the Nazis never won another victory ever again. The Soviet Union's going to push them all the way out of Russia and push them back into Germany. And if you want to listen to an incredible account that uses a lot of primary sources about the Battle of Stalingrad, listen to this podcast called Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, his series called The Ghosts of the Ostfront. If you can't find it online, you can ask me and I can share a version of it with you. But it is absolutely one of my favorite podcast series of all time, because it really gets down to how the Soviet Union finally defeated the Nazis in this famous battle. All right, moving on. So, World War II also had some new military technologies, of course, that altered warfare for the rest of world history. World War II creates the first assault rifles, and these sort of like, personal handheld machine guns that just shoot bullets really, really fast, and people can run around with them really easily. And then also there was a whole lot of stuff related to airplanes in World War II. World War I barely had that many airplanes, as far as a full count. But World War II was a war fought in the skies. And there's these big, giant bomber planes now that are long-distance bombing places. And we came up with some new ways of causing incredible death and destruction. This concept called firebombing, where these bombers would put these special bombs over a city to sort of cause these fire tornadoes. And this is something that the Allied powers did. The United States, we firebombed the cities of Tokyo, Dresden, and Hamburg, and just basically turned those cities into ash. Like, here's a picture of, I think this is Dresden after we firebombed it. We also created aircraft carriers during World War II, which are just giant ships that serve as airfields. And it allows you to just fly planes from ships. It's pretty great. And we actually found out during World War II that aircraft carriers are way better than all other forms of ships. Battleships and old steamer ships and all the ships of the past are just kind of worthless when compared to aircraft carriers. So the way you can kind of measure a modern Navy's effectiveness is how many aircraft carriers do they have. And anyway, I could get into all that stuff later. But aircraft carriers, they are the most important thing in any country's Navy ever since World War II proved that. And literally the last thing in World War II was the United States invented atomic weapons. And here's a picture of an atomic bomb right here. And atomic bombs are where you split a uranium atom and it causes an unbelievable explosion that can wipe out an entire city. And atomic bombs are definitely going to change the nature of warfare for the rest of world history as well. All right, moving on. So, very important thing with World War II is before World War II, the United States wasn't a major country in the world. Like, maybe we were top 10, but I don't even think we were top 5 at the start of World War II. We were just, on the other side of the world, this relatively new country. Yes, we were industrialized, but we weren't as involved or as a major participant in global politics and the global economy. But once we did join World War II, our country went into full total war mode. We became the best total war economy that ever existed in the world. Okay, like every single American got a job in a factory. I can even show you primary sources where we sent letters to Mexico and we said, Mexican workers, please come to the United States. Illegally come here if you have to. No one will punish you. We need more workers in our factory. We need to build more guns. We need to build more planes. We need to build more tanks. We have to defeat the Japanese and the Nazis. And so, we were just bringing everybody into this country. Everybody was working in factories. Everybody was making guns, tanks, and planes. And we provided that material for free to the Soviet Union, to the British, and obviously to ourselves. And just the sheer amount of war material blows my mind that the United States made. Like, in the first year that we were in the war, in 1942, we already made more war material than the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese combined. And by the year 1945, we made more than half of all the products on planet Earth Just about everything in 1945 said made in the USA. This was the most incredible economic transformation that I'm going to argue ever happened in world history. America just got to work and got it done. And let me share some statistics with you, okay? So, the United States, we made these things called Liberty ships, which were these just boats that just carried war material and supplies all around the world to help fight in World War II. And originally, a Liberty ship took 365 days to build. But Americans were encouraged to use our kind of creative energy. And it's like, how can you still build a good Liberty ship, but just build it faster? And we came up with these new strategies for using less rivets in certain spots and using quick dry paint and only having 2 main decks instead of 3. And in the end, we managed to make a Liberty ship in 7 days. In the Stockton shipyards rather than in 365 days, which I was like, what? Reduced it from a year to a week. And then also there's this factory where we built bomber airplanes. Here's a picture of it right here called Willow Run, where we took the assembly line process and just made it into the most incredible manufacturing system ever. So these are bomber planes that we used to drop bombs on Germany and Japan. Each of these bomber planes has 500,000 individual parts. So imagine putting together a Lego set with 500,000 pieces. But with just the incredible ability to have standardized procedures and processes, they built this factory that was a mile long, and they had something like, it had to be at least 20,000 people working in there. And there's just one guy put on the propellers on the wings and then push the bomber down, and one guy put on the wheels and push the bomber down, and they each did that assembly line process again and again and again. And these bombers originally took 30 days to build, but at the factory of Willow Run, we were sending a bomber out of this factory, 1 bomber every hour. We made a plane every 60 minutes in one factory, and we had thousands of factories. And my grandfather was one of these factory foremen who watched people build airplanes all day during World War II. And I mean, by all accounts, like, we were the industrial superpower. And during this war, we built up the American military to this huge degree. And by the time this war ends, America is going to be the biggest military power, one of the 2 big military powers on planet Earth. So, boom, outproduced them, and that's why we win World War II. Okay, we had way more stuff than the Germans and the Japanese ever could compete with. Okay, so the Germans just can't put up against all this war material that's coming their way, and so much of the stuff that was built in American factories, we just give it to our friends in the Soviet Union, we give it to our friends in Great Britain, and all this stuff just comes to the Nazis. They can't fight back. The Soviet Union rallied after the Battle of Stalingrad. They're pushing deep. They take back all the lands of the Soviet Union. In this almost suicidal path where Hitler says, okay, everyone's going to fight to the bitter end. Everybody's got to fight through the streets of Berlin itself. And only when the Soviet army is like 300 yards away from his bunker, that's when Hitler takes his own life and the war ends for the Nazis. The surviving Nazi government unconditionally surrenders to the Allies, but this time, the Allies, we learned our lesson from World War I, okay? When we punish the Germans this time, we don't force them to pay big reparations. We don't limit the size of their military. In fact, the United States actually gives Germany money to help rebuild after World War II. We do put some stipulations saying, hey, no more Nazis. Hey, no more trying to take over the world. But this time the Germans were thoroughly beaten. And I will tell you this, the culture of the German people has dramatically changed since after their loss in World War II. They recognized that they were the aggressors this time. They recognized that Hitler sent them on a really bad path, and Germany will never be a major world power again. They will never start another world war, at least through the course of my lifetime. I'm positive about that. So Germany got beat so bad, they will never, ever rise again. That is a fact. All right, moving on. Okay, and Japan, on the other hand, Japan also does this desperate fight to the bitter end. The United States, we take back all of the islands. We help China push the Japanese out. The Soviet Union pushes in Japan from the north. But the Japanese continually refuse to surrender. Okay, they respond with suicidal devotion. They have their pilots fly planes loaded with bombs and say, crash your plane directly into America's ships. These guys are called kamikazes. These really freaked out the United States. That shows how committed the Japanese are. And look, I could even tell you about surrender statistics in World War II. Like, just about every major military in World War II had 100,000 or more of their soldiers surrender at some point in the war and became prisoners of war. But the Japanese never surrendered. Maybe there were 1,000 total. And it just shows the different cultural aspects of how they fought this war. Because in the Japanese language, there is no word for surrender. Surrender and defeat is the same word. So it's kind of hard for them to understand that concept. But once the United States had conquered almost all of Japan's outlying islands, we started preparing to invade Japan itself. But right around that time, we invented atomic weapons. And we decided to use them against the Japanese, and we destroyed 2 of their cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And after the realization that we now have these planes that can drop one bomb, and this one bomb can annihilate a city, that's when the Japanese emperor decided to give up the war, and he announced a surrender over the radio. I know that there's a lot of resources out there for teachers to use, saying like how cruel it was that the United States used the atomic bomb. And look, I'm not going to deny that atomic weapons are cruel. I mean, they are the most powerful weapons in all of world history. They are unbelievably cruel. They annihilated 250,000 people in a single day. But the firebombing of Tokyo also annihilated 500,000 people in a single day. The Battle of the Somme in World War I killed 60,000 men in an hour. Like, there's terrible, terrible things that happened in world history. And yes, the atomic bomb is one of them, but I don't think the atomic bomb is special by any interesting means. And when I was in college, I wrote a 50-page research paper about using the atomic bomb and what the decision that was made behind it. And it really wasn't debated at the time. It was the American president was like, hey, I've got another weapon to fight the war. I'm going to use it. We all knew the stakes of this war. We knew how serious it was. And anything we could have done to use against the Japanese, we would have used it. So, and also, if you want to listen to a very good podcast series about the Japanese experience in World War II, there is a same series called Hardcore History on Hardcore History by Dan Carlin, but this series is called Supernova in the East. He actually hasn't released the final episode yet, but I know it's going to be good. I've already listened to like 4 of the episodes. Big fan. All right, moving on. So, the Allies win the war. Hooray! Yes. And I'll discuss the full aftermath of World War II in the next unit, but know that World War II did it not set up a World War III? Oh, that would be an interesting LEQ debate. Did World War II set up a supposed World War III? I might get into that in the next unit, but overall, we'll stop it there for now. Okay, but actually, we're not officially stopping it there. I gotta tell you all about China, all right? China needs to get a little more credit here. So, during World War II, China officially fought on behalf of the Allies, and they officially fought the Japanese, but China was functionally a mess, okay? Poor China, still in the century of humiliation. The last Qing emperor, a dude named Pu Yi, here's a bunch of pictures of him down here at the bottom of this presentation. Pu Yi sided with the Japanese during World War II. Terrible choice, bro. He believed that Japan would help his people with Chinese industrialization. He kind of fell under the spell of that Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere stuff. and he really thought that the Japanese were like doing good stuff for China, I guess. But in reality, he was tasked with enforcing these pro-Japanese policies. He was tasked with allowing the Japanese to just harvest all the resources and all the goods out of China. He was tasked with allowing the Japanese to murder millions of Chinese citizens. So he brought just an incredible amount of shame and destruction on China. And the people of China do not have a fond memory of the last Qing Emperor Puyi. And I just think Puyi's life is so interesting because at the end of the war, he's captured, and the Chinese government confiscates all his possessions. They turn the Forbidden City, his former home, into a museum, and these are some of his clothes on display in the Forbidden City today because it's now a museum. And people just assumed that he would be put on trial and executed. That's generally what happens to traitors in serious world wars. But the new leaders of China instead decide to make an example of him. They imprison him for 10 years. They put him in kind of a re-education camp. And once he is released from that re-education camp, they give him a job as a gardener where he's paid $100 a month. And he works at the garden in the Forbidden City. That concept blows my mind that there were tourists who walked through the Forbidden City in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and they were pointing at oh wow, the last Qing emperor wore that outfit, and then they would look outside the window and they'd see this old guy working on the flowers, and sure enough, it's the last Qing emperor. What? Crazy. Whew. All right, moving on. Okay, so during the entirety of World War II, China was also fighting a civil war. So it's kind of a similar vibe to what Russia was doing in World War I. And also, just like the Russian experience in World War I, the war was largely between capitalists and communists. And also, just like the war in World War I, the communists eventually win. And these communist socialists are led by this guy named Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong becomes the undisputed leader of China when all this is over. And as soon as he becomes leader of China, he says, okay, this is China's new policy forward. We're going to finally get out of the century of humiliation. I'm going to lead China to have this one-party rule, and we're going to also kick out all imperialist influence. We're going to put China on the right path and bring back China's place as, being a major, major world power. Mao's initial decisions won't work out so well. I'll cover those at length in the next unit. But today China is the number 2 country in the world, so they are bringing themselves back up, and they're officially out of the century of humiliation at this point. All right, and that topic will be for the last video. All right, that's it for me. Peace out.